You've heard the conventional view. Now prepare yourself to hear the other side. High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison and Spears.
Good Tuesday evening to listeners out there. We are excited to be with you this evening for another episode of The Other Side. As always, we'd like to leave you our information. You can get a hold of us in so many different formats, and we really encourage our listeners. I've had some personal conversations with people recently. It seems like more and more people are reaching out to me saying, I really like the show. And we really appreciate that, by the way. That means a lot to us here to know that we're putting the time and effort in to spread our message and our worldview and to encourage people to think about the topics that we present here on The Other Side. So to get right to it, you can catch us on our Facebook account at TOS_podcast. You can catch us on Twitter at TOS Podcast. We have our personal Twitter accounts. I'm at Justin Spears 4. Mike is at Mr. Margison on Twitter. And then I have a personal Facebook page. If you just search for Justin Spears, you will find me on there. The ways in which you can listen to this show are numerous. You can catch us live on our Facebook, on our YouTube channel, Mike Justin, and you can search The Other Side Podcast and you'll find us there. You can listen to us on the Spreaker app. Podcasting app that also seeds out our podcast through RSS to iTunes and to Google Play Podcasts. And last but not least, you can hear us Saturday mornings on WCVLAM.com, 1550, 92.1 FM out of Crawfordsville, Indiana. And as always, we are a part of the Cerberus Radio Network. There is some great talent, some great shows that you can catch over there. Suzanne Sherman has a show called The Wasatch Report. You've got Jeff and Dan with the Renegade and Rambler show and their personal shows as well. So just tons of great programming on the Cerberus Radio Network. And we broadcast there on Radio Co. Our show airs nightly at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So just literally tons of ways in which you can catch this show and reach out to us. And again, I highly encourage that. I get, seems like more and more people each week that reach out to us and say something about our shows. And that's what we're doing this for. That's why we're doing this. So really, really excited about that. So without further ado, I want to bring in the other side of The Other Side, Mr. Mike Margison. Mike, what's going on tonight, man?
Not much. Excited to get going.
Now, that's awesome. So what we wanted to do here this evening, guys, is kind of take a little bit of a break from what we've been presenting as far as topical / current event items and presenting, as we always do each and every week, the other side of these topics, you know, beyond the conventional wisdom and what you'll get in the mainstream media or textbooks in the classroom and kind of like a re-education type thing. And again, you know, we have said from the beginning that we're not here to encourage you necessarily what to think, but to think. And we both as high school teachers see a lack and an apathy and a desire to want to learn and to go out and take these topics on. And so we thought we're in a 1-year period since we started the show, and we thought we would share with you guys the inspiration for why we even started this thing. You know, Mike and I being high school teachers, like-minded, we were having conversations about this time a year ago, and we both kind of said to each other, hey, we're thinking about starting a podcast. You know, I'm thinking about starting one. I said, oh, yeah, that's great. I am too. And so we kind of put 2 and 2 together. And the conversations that we were having leading up to that focused around a couple of other podcasts that were already out there that we listened to. And in particular, they were the Tom Woods Show and another show called Contra Krugman, which guest hosts are Tom Woods and Bob Murphy. And so we thought we would give you guys a little bit of an insight as to who these guys are and why they have been so much of a blueprint on the way that we've shaped our worldview. Now, you know, when I say Tom and Bob, listeners in Central Indiana might go, well, you're mistaken. It's Bob and Tom, right? You know, the disc jockey, the hosts here with the Bob and Tom show. And no, this is Tom and Bob. And I don't know if they necessarily care in which order the names come, but that's just how it's always rolled off our tongues there. So, Yeah. So at any rate, Mike, I wanted to kind of have you start out and maybe kind of give us the listeners a little bit of insight as to, maybe the impact that both of these guys have had on you and your personal worldview and how you've come to grow and how you view the social studies.
Well, yeah, I mean, they completely changed the way that I view the social studies. And as a social studies teacher, and you are too, that's huge. I mean, that impacts the way that we work. So, and I first came on to the politically incorrect guide to U.S. history about, oh God, it was right when it came out. So that would have been about 12 or 13 years ago. And this was Tom Woods' first book. And for those listeners who don't know, Tom Woods Jr. is a historian. He is a graduate of undergrad at Harvard in history and a PhD from Columbia in history. And he's an author, like Justin said, also hosts a show. And I didn't know who he was, but in 2004, I had just gotten my teaching license. Actually, I think I got it in late 2003. That was my second major. I originally was a political science major, but went into education. And so I finished my student teaching in 2003. I had done that in world history. And in 2004, I got my first teaching assignment, and it was U.S. history during summer school. There was no openings available full-time on staff, but they had some openings for summer school. And so I jumped in and I did that. And I taught an entire U.S. history course. It was a lot of fun. So it was my first ever teaching assignment. And after that, even though I had done my student teaching in world history, I loved what I did there in the summer school. And so I said, okay, that's it. I want to focus on U.S. history. I want to be a U.S. history teacher. And so I started gathering up as much information as I could. And I came across this book. It was called The Politically Incorrect Guide to U.S. History. And I thought that was a provocative title. And coming from a, I guess, non-leftist background, I thought that was interesting. So I picked it up, I read it, and honestly, it knocked me over. Not so much, I mean, the first thing I realized was how little I actually knew about U.S. history. And it was embarrassing because I just came off teaching other kids about United States history. And then I had to face the fact, I read this book and I was like, oh my God, I don't know anything. Like I literally felt like I didn't know anything. I hadn't learned anything. And then I had this, sense of betrayal where, stuff that had been taught to me, professors that had taught me, they just left out like 9/10 of the actual relevant facts. And so I loved it. And I ate this up. And well, the first thing I did was I had to corroborate it. I didn't know who Tom Woods was. And so you have to look it up and say, okay, is this guy just a quack or did this stuff really happen? And yeah, I mean, all of it, of course, is anybody who knows Woods, it's perfectly researched. And the thing about his writing is it's very accessible. It's not wonkish or anything like that. It's not difficult to read. And so I ate that up. And this is what I refer to this often as my re-education because I learned literally nothing in high school and college. And a lot of that is my fault. I was a terrible student, but I actually did learn nothing. I wasn't interested in any of the material. The professors didn't engage me or anything like that. But after I read this book, I couldn't get enough. And so I think a couple of years after that, the 33 questions about U.S. history you're not supposed to ask came out. I think that came out in 2007. I gobbled that up, loved it. And then he started the Liberty Classroom a couple years after that. And then the Tom Woods Show, I think probably about 5 years ago. And if you aren't familiar with the Liberty Classroom, these are U.S. history. Well, it's all sorts of, it's basically every topic in the social studies, but it's lectures on U.S. history, on topics that you can get. And let me just say this, we're not like affiliate marketers here or anything like that. We're not trying to push or sell this stuff. This is just stuff that we, came across and read and listened to and liked. And it honestly did change the way that I view the social studies. I used to be pretty mainstream Republican and I guess neoconservative. And, of the general view that, I mean, it was like Yeah, of course you need government. I guess less would be better. But I mean, the way I used to view social studies was, should the tax rate be 39% or 28%? Something like that. It's just, I thought that was the main argument that we were having. And no, it's just so much deeper and more complex than that when you actually look at this federal apparatus, this increasingly growing tentacles into our everyday lives, and how the whole thing is totally unnecessary. So yeah, it's shaped me a bunch. And then of course through the Tom Woods show, that's when I came on to Bob Murphy and his work. And Murphy also is an author. He's an economist, not a historian. He's an economist, and he authored the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal, and also, I believe, the Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism. And you will learn more economics and history in these two books than you will have ever learned in your 4 years in college. I guarantee it. I mean, seriously, just read these three politically incorrect guides: the one to U.S. history from Woods, the Great Depression and New Deal from Murphy, and then the Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism from Murphy. And it will knock your socks off if you haven't gotten into this type of literature, or at least give it a try. It will. If it might not, you might read it and say, okay, no, it's not for me. I still think that there is a decent role for government. I think that FDR did a good job and the New Deal was great. And, yeah, that's fine, but at least expose yourself to it. So yeah, that's just kind of the journey that I went through listening to these guys. And then of course, through the podcast, we really, we enjoyed listening to Contra Krugman. We used to come in and weekly and kind of discuss the episode. And yeah, when we started talking about the podcast, it was kind of obvious that those were our main influences. What about yourself, Justin? How did they influence you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key thing that you talked about there, and you know what, I think this is a learning opportunity for everybody, is you have to have a sense of humility about learning, right? You almost kind of have to have this understanding that I think it's a human characteristic and trait to think that you've learned something, therefore you've mastered it. We always talk about mastery level of content. But the reality is that, you're never done learning. You're always learning. And so there's that little bit of humility that you have to have inherently to be open to seeing things. And I'm still that way even today, even though my worldview has evolved so drastically since I've been introduced to the concepts of people like Murphy and Woods. But yeah, I too found myself in the classroom. I had taught business the first 6 or 7 years of my teaching career. And I'm a non-traditional teacher. So even before that, I was in the business world. And so I got a little bit of a later jump on being introduced to these guys and some of the other libertarian / Mises ideas that we've wrapped around and embraced. And so I remember vividly, coming to the school that we're at together now. And I probably, you probably kind of chuckled and laughed. I remember walking down to your room one day and going, man, have you heard of this Mises Institute? And you were like, yeah. And, it was a brand new world. And it was kind of one of those things where it's just like somebody pours gasoline onto a fire and it just ignites you. And I just remember starting to, slowly but surely, it was kind of the same thing. I'm listening to Woods, I'm listening to Contra Krugman, I'm reading things from Mises Institute, I'm reading Lou Rockwell, I'm starting to read, Murray Rothbard, I'm starting to read Hans Hermann Hoppe. I'm just going through and consuming Hayek. The list goes on of just the great minds that just completely reconfigured my way of thinking and how I went about the way that I teach government and economics. And, in particular, I think that it really kind of, because I'm probably from the same line that you were, mainstream Republican, more of a neocon. And I'm just reading this. And I think Tom has talked about this in his transformation as well, to where he was kind of, in the same boat. And I think he talked about maybe it was possibly the first Gulf War and the case that was being made, and maybe a professor that he had, who I think he said was even a liberal professor at the time, that kind of pushed him on, he was buying into this and just his evolution there as well. And,
Well,
so
I think the professor was pro-war, if I'm not
right.
mistaken.
Yeah. That's what I'm sorry. Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry if I misrepresented that there, but and so just listening to his journey as well was inspiring as well. And so, yeah, I think it's just kind of reignited a sense and understanding of realigning my worldview to the point where, if I were to say, yes, I am a libertarian, and the reason why is partly because obviously, I agree with the principles of the libertarian platform and party, but also too because I'm such an advocate for it because it doesn't get pushed, it doesn't get played, it doesn't get considered. When I see posts on Twitter and Facebook from people who are outside of the libertarian party or mindset, it's more of this like you're kooky, you're wacky, no gov, non-aggression policy, taxation is theft. There's all these different slogans and taglines that libertarians often use and refrain echoes of, and it's just you hear those things and you think, oh, that's just kooky fringe thinking. And so I like to try to bring that to people and let it like set in. It's like a truth serum. At some point, if you give it a go and you give it a listen, then it's going to, I think, infect you in a positive way and force you to kind of recalibrate the way that you've always thought of things, which obviously, as we know, is so shaped by the public education system and the mainstream media.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I want to touch upon what you said at the beginning about the humility aspect. First of all, I think it's important I am not, I don't want to say was, I am very stubborn. I mean, like almost notoriously stubborn. But one of the reality is that you don't know what you don't know. It's one of those things where you kind of hate to admit you're wrong, or hate to admit that arguments that you made in the past were ill-conceived, but it's natural. It's completely reasonable. And I think you were hitting on this pretty well. People just need to give it a shot. I think one of the things that prevents people from even considering this is it might require them to actually question their belief system. And if you do that, then it might require you to say, you know what, I was wrong about a lot of stuff. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. So through, Woods and Murphy and this whole, group of, Austrian thinking and libertarianism, I had never heard of Murray Rothbard until, whatever it is, 5 years ago or something. Like, I mean, I'd never even heard of him. And, I was 35 years old and I consider myself somewhat proficient in the social studies. And I started reading through him. And as I read more and more, I remember the first thing that he convinced me of, that where I did a 180, was that the dropping of the atomic bomb was the wrong thing to do. I had always taught that when I taught world history, I had always taught that. I never really expressed the way I believed to the kids, but we would talk about like, okay, is this okay? How many American lives did it save? Considering that we, were able to avoid a ground assault and such. And then of course you had to weigh that against the civilians who were dead. But as you go through and I read this, I remember in the Rothbard Reader, it was a response that he had to William F. Buckley Jr. And it was through reading this, I realized, that it's unjustifiable. I mean, it's completely unjustifiable. The fact that we would drop a bomb and kill 200,000 civilians, even though it was a war. I mean, I still can't think of where and why I even justified that or how I justified that. But I do know that when I used to teach world history, and when we get to World War II, in my mind, I always thought, it was the right thing to do because it saved American lives. It saved the lives of American soldiers. And it wasn't until I actually read Rothbard and listened to this line of reasoning to where I had to look back at my own thoughts and say, that was wrong, like way wrong. And so I did that 180. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, what's interesting about that too, Mike, and I know that we, and by we, I guess I'll just speak for myself. I know I, in particular, have always been very critical of celebrities in politics, and taking their opinions in, with a grain of salt. But I think it's interesting. Have you noticed there have been some high profile celebrities here recently that have come out and questioned things like what the government is doing? I mean, I know there's been this big Kanye West thing with Trump, but apparently there was another like hip hop artist star that had come out and said basically like, hey, what is the government doing with our tax dollars? We need to know more about what's being done. And then I saw Reggie Bush actually tweeted out something the other day about auditing the Fed. And, again, that's something that, and I think it was a sincere, post. It was, kind of based in, hey, who edits the IRS and making sure that what they're doing with our tax dollars is the right stuff. And so, I know that's probably, maybe pie in the sky or wishful thinking, but it is kind of encouraging to see because look, at the end of the day, we can criticize Hollywood and entertainment as, low grade, lowest common denominator, appeal to the masses. But at some point, we do have to recognize the reach that they have and at least give it credence to say, hey, they have a platform to be able to push a message. Now, some people might say, well, yeah, you only want that when it's your message that's being pushed. And maybe that's true. I mean, maybe there's something to that. Yeah. But, now, yeah, the other thing I was going to mention here real quickly, too, is kind of a defining turning moment for me. You were kind of talking about that idea of being introduced to Rothbard for the first time. And I highly encourage people to check Rothbard out, man. He is just so sharp and witty. But I know for me, the one that really kind of tilted the scales for me, because I dabbled in and listening to it, and it slowly but surely was starting to come around. But I think the kind of the tipping point, so to speak, was an episode that Woods did. I listened to on the way back from Cincinnati one day. I had gone over for the weekend, and it was on Lysander Spooner. And Lysander Spooner was a gentleman who wrote a piece called No Treason. And basically, it was on kind of a defense of, that there's no constitutionality to slavery, that basically, there's no way that you could defend it. And so therefore, because it is allowed in the Constitution, therefore, essentially, and I could be misrepresenting this is my take on it, that the Constitution then doesn't have any validity to it. And it was pretty strong language. And I remember kind of listening to this and thinking like, man, this is radical stuff here. But then it just, like I said earlier, it's kind of like that truth serum, man. It just started to sink in. And it was like, God, he's right. But you're never going to hear anybody in the mainstream. You're never going to read this in textbooks. You're never going to hear people on Fox News or CNN or, MSNBC talking about this stuff. Yet it's so pertinent. And I think, and especially with that topic, transcends both liberal and conservatives who, I think could agree that, obviously the slavery issue was handled the wrong way in American history. And I'm thinking, here's a guy that was speaking clearly about this topic. And it was just one of those things to me that was like, there was no turning back at that point. I was all in on it. And I just started to consume more and more of the Austrian/libertarian mindset. And again, introduced by by Wood's show. So again, just another fingerprint of his work, resonating with me in my development.
Can we talk a little bit here about how right they were leading up to the economic collapse in 2009? Because that's another thing that had really caught me. And maybe we can, maybe it's time to do a episode about Austrian economics, because I think we did one a while back when we just contrasted what causes recessions. But this Austrian school of economic thinking, it literally has nothing to do with Austria. The only point is that the originators here happen to be Austrian. But it's this methodology, this line of thinking in economics is it predicted the housing collapse of 2008. And Peter Schiff, Justin, he was there. You can just anybody go and Google like Peter Schiff housing crash or something like that, and you'll see these Fox News video where he's on Fox News Business. This is one that stands out to me. It's in 2006, and he is predicting the crash right there. He's saying it, and everybody else on the panel is laughing at him. You know, they're in 2000, they're basically laughing at him. And the Austrians were able to predict that. And I think in 2008, it started to get like a little bit of traction, but now it seems like it's kind of faded away. You know, have you noticed that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Which is unfortunate because, yeah, if we're just back to whatever, racking up debt, and we're going to go through the same thing again, and maybe it'll get some traction again after the next, you know, major collapse. But yeah, it is interesting to point out that this relatively small group of people were perfectly correct about the economic collapse. And it feels like they just get no credit for it. Like nobody ever even talks about it.
Yeah, that's a great point, and to kind of piggyback off of that as well. You know, for our listeners, those that may be catching the show on replay, you know, I want you to think about this as well. Both of these guys are doctors, Dr. Tom Woods and Dr. Robert Murphy, Bob Murphy. But if you explore and read through their material, and as you were kind of just alluding to there, you know, the stuff about calling the crash, you can find academic writing, but then there's so much out there written. Like I think you mentioned this early on in kind of your description of what appealed to you about their writing and their shows, is that they don't write over your head. I'm currently reading through the 33 Questions book that you mentioned, excuse me, earlier. And the thing that stands out to me is he tackles all these points, and it's like just cutting. It's so deep and rich, but it's done in such a brilliantly simple way. And I don't mean that as in like he dumbs it down, but the fact that he can address a position so succinctly in just a matter of 3 or 4 pages, usually, but just packed so condensed with information that it leaves you saying, I want to go learn more about this now. But he just does such a brilliant job. And there's all kinds of information that you can get on these guys. You mentioned the Liberty Classroom. I know one of the things that he has talked about before in conjunction, I think, with that is the Ron Paul homeschool curriculum, which is, if you're out there in the homeschooling market, my understanding is top notch. Just, you're not going to find anything better across the board curriculum wise than the Ron Paul homeschool curriculum. And I know Tom in particular, I don't know if Bob's had much of a hand in that one or not, but I know Tom has for sure had a big impact on that as well. So, you know, there's just a variety of different entry points, I guess is what I'm trying to say here, that you can start to learn a little bit. If you feel like, gosh, this is a lot, it's overwhelming, you know, find a topic, go look through the archives of their shows, Google them, and I'm sure you can find some of their published work. You unfortunately probably won't find a lot of their books at like Amazon, or I'm sorry, at Barnes and Noble. You have to go online to like Amazon to find them, more than likely, although you may find them in print bookstores. It'd just be a little bit more difficult, I think. But, you know, just again, I can't put them over enough. And I know you mentioned, you know, we're not affiliates or anything, but I would 100% co-sign on almost everything that they've done, and would highly encourage the listeners to go out. As we said, you know, as we start to maybe wrap this up, I can't overstate the impact that they've had on me as an educator, as a man, the way that I have my worldview set. You know, I think about it as a father, for example, and how I'm trying to impart upon my kids the wisdom of things like the non-aggression policy and personal responsibility, and things of that nature. It really has molded me in more ways than one.
Yeah, absolutely. In these last couple of minutes, I want to talk a little bit about Bob Murphy, because you know, the economic side, there are a lot of people who are interested in history just kind of as a, you know, just as a passion. And if you're listening and you're interested in history and you do not know Tom Woods, this is a must. You got to pick it up. But Bob Murphy, he's a PhD in economics from New York University, and he's a brilliant economist. But and I know we're running low on time here, so I feel like he's getting shorted. But I do want to say, this coming from me, and anybody who has known me in the past would be surprised to hear this. He has, I wouldn't say convinced me, But again, if you're willing to listen, he had this he did a debate on one of their shows about the privatization of the military. And when you hear that, you almost think like, okay, that's not possible. Like how would it be organized? How would it be unified? But he is very much an anarchist. Like I never would have even considered the term anarchist just because it comes with such a negative connotation. And I would say that I am very, very close to being on the border of tipping over into anarchy, where once you hear the argument laid out in front of you. Now, we've all been exposed to the other argument. That's the whole point of this podcast. So I know the entire, first side. But like I said before, you don't know what you don't know. And if you're willing to listen and you're willing to entertain arguments, and then you set what you've learned and you set what you've just heard side by side, and you just give it some thought. This is again just an example, kind of like the Rothbard and the dropping of the A-bomb. But I never would have even I would have laughed somebody out of the room 5 years ago if they said, "Yeah, I think we should or can privatize the military." Or privatized defense in this country. There's no need for a national defense. He makes a very compelling case for it. I mean, he makes a brilliant case for it, in fact. And I think there are arguments to be made. But I mean, Murphy has argued that you don't even need a judicial system in this country. I mean, you like police force. All of it, people can do it. People can make arrangements on their own. We can kind of do this in an anarchical fashion, and we can live without overlords telling us what to do and what not to do. And again, I think a lot of people will listen to that and they'll just say, okay, that's just foolish. Well, give it a listen. I mean, at least give it a try, because you might be convinced too. And I'm bought in. I fully believe it, that there is virtually no point to government other than to oppress. But you have to be willing to listen first.
Yeah, that's a tremendous closing point. And again, being open-minded, being, humble and having some humility about all this will certainly help you open your mind to what you'll hear here. I know I speak for both Mike and I when I say thank you, Tom. Thank you, Bob, for the tireless hours that you put in to your writing, to your shows. I know sometimes when you're doing these things, you may not know the impact that you're having, but it is very impactful. And we thank you guys so much for the inspiration that you've given to us. And hopefully we can continue to crank out episodes as well that are inspired by what we hear and read from you guys. So thank you so much for that. So again, we hope to continue to move forward with the show. 1 year in now, we're continually looking for ways to tweak and alter the program and make it better. And really the only way we can do that is from input from our listeners. So please, if you're listening to this show and you hear anything that you'd like to talk more about or have suggestions for us, we are ears wide open, ready to listen and get better. So thanks again for tuning in. This has been The Other Side.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you're not fully informed until you've heard